I hope you listened or sang along with that last song because the people we're going to be looking at this morning in Mark chapter 5 are pretty desperate people as well. So I'm just going to jump in right off here, and I'm going to start in verse 21 of Mark chapter 5 if you've got your Bible there with you. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, it's like the last few stories, he's been on this lake, just sort of like a water taxi going all over the place here. A large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." And so Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. It's kind of like a first century mosh pit of some sort, So they're pressing around him, and then a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, and he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples are telling him, "You see the people crowding against you, and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. And then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" Well, ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He didn't let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly, and he went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And immediately the girl stood up and walked around, and she was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. So one of these ladies we just read about is a woman who has suffered with a disease of bleeding. It's sort of like this non-stop heavy period for 12 years. And she, as Mark says, has suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors. And she hasn't gotten better. And in her culture, because of the kind of bleeding that she has certainly been religiously unclean, meaning that she can't fully participate in worship for 12 years. She can't really be connected to her community for 12 years. And so she's not just diseased in body, she's diseased socially. And she has suffered a great deal. But she believes in miracles. She's heard these rumors about this Jesus guy. And he's said to have healed lepers and paralytics in Capernaum. And she thinks that if she can just touch this miracle worker's garment, then maybe this disease will go away. And maybe I can get my life back. And when you read this story, you probably visualize what she might have looked like. But you also might be thinking about people you know who've sort of been physically or socially broken. Maybe it's a friend of yours, or maybe some family member, or maybe it's even yourself that you're thinking about. One of the people whose faces comes to, to my mind when I read about this passage is my dad. It was kind of startling when we found out that he had cancer, but at first, nothing looked that different in him, and so people almost treated him the same. But as time went on, he began to deteriorate, and the cancer spread, and he became more and more gaunt. He lost mobility and vision and hearing. And I remember talking to him on the phone one last time when he was back east and I was here in California. And it's just hard to explain how difficult it is to talk to your dying father on the phone when he can't hardly talk himself and he can't hear anything that you're saying at all. They had radiated his body. They had radiated his brain. They pumped him full of poisons. He had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors. And it would have been nice to have seen a miracle, to have had the opportunity to be able to reach out and touch the garment of Jesus and be healed, to be relieved of the disease and experience again what it would feel like to be whole. I think about my wife and the treatments that she has had over the last year here and the ones that are likely coming. That'll be much more aggressive and much more discomforting. Think about different faces in Haiti. Those of people who had leprosy, who had lost feet and fingers and noses, and those who have been separated from their community because of their disease. And I think about one time when two of my buddies and I were in Haiti, and we had gone down to Port-au-Prince, and we had set out to find Mother Teresa's orphanage there. And when we finally found it and got inside, some of the children were so excited. They were so happy to have visitors, so much so that they just were piling on top of us. And so I had, all these kids crawling all over me, which was a blast. And they were just giggling like crazy. And at the same time, they were trying to take my watch off and steal it. But a little while later, the nuns led us to a room where crib after crib after crib, there were babies and toddlers and small children who were dying from AIDS or malnutrition. They'd been abandoned by their family, many of them with those distended bellies and what was left of a little bit of orange hair. Their arms and legs are kind of like twigs. And I just remember they had these blank stares. And that it was so quiet in there. And my two friends and I, after the nuns let us out of there after a while, we went back to our truck and we were in silence. And how we wished we could have had the ability to do some miracles. And I know that some of you can't read about this 12-year-old girl in Mark 5 without thinking about a child or a close family member or a friend that you've had to bury too soon. I can't think about it without or I can't read about it without thinking about our second son. To see the doctors and the nurses not be able to revive him, and how desperately we all would have loved to have seen a miracle. Just to see him open his eyes, just to hear his heartbeat again. And I think about our dear sister, Lauren Ray, young and beautiful, and how she suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, and how desperately we all would have loved to have seen a miracle. So those are some of the faces that I see when I read these stories. And I mention those people so that we will be reminded that the people that we're reading about here in Mark 5, they're not just story characters. They are real people, just like some of the people that you are thinking of. And what kind of joy would you experience if Jesus, in his compassion, told you, okay, I'll give you what you ask for and make you whole and raise you up? These two stories with these two women here have some unique linkages. Some scholars call this a Markan sandwich. If you've been coming to our class in Mark, you'll know what that is. But basically, you kind of start with this slice of bread of the young girl at the beginning, and then you put the diseased woman in the middle, and it's followed by this other slice of bread of the young girl at the end. Both of these stories have, as I said, these female characters at the center. And females were typically of, unfortunately, but true, lower status in the ancient world. And so it stands out to have two females mixed together here. The woman who had been bleeding, she'd been bleeding for how long? 12 years, right? And how old is the little girl? 12 years old. There's this connection there. And they are both unclean. The woman is unclean because of this disease of bleeding that she's had. The girl's unclean because she's dead. And Jesus extends his compassion and healing to both. But while Jesus's compassion and ability to heal play a role in these stories, I don't think that those are at the heart of these two stories. I really think that at the heart of these stories is a comparison between following miracles and following Jesus. And throughout history, people have been drawn to miracles, to magic, to the supernatural, even something like, new secret ingredients to a healthier life. And we see these supplements coming out all the time, the Garcinia cambrosia or ginkgo biloba. And quinoa is a superfood, supplements and alternative medicines. There is a hunger in us for something new and healing. Superhero movies are big dollar makers in our culture. And who hasn't thought about what it would be like to have a superhero power or two? I'm sure you've thought about, you'd love to have a power or two, especially if you had teenagers. You probably had some things you wish you could do. Maybe you would like to fly. Maybe you'd like to breathe underwater. Maybe teleporting is your thing. And don't you think, even when you feel like you have your best motives, at the forefront, don't you think that if you had certain powers, you could be more useful in the ministry of Jesus? I mean, what would it be like to have that amazing gift of healing? And I tell you, I prayed for that when I was in Haiti. And it wasn't just in passing. I earnestly prayed for that. I just see so many people who are suffering. And I absolutely believed I had good motives. And wouldn't the ability to heal be good for God's kingdom? But in each of these stories in Mark, I don't think that the emphasis is on miracles. The emphasis is on faith and in following Jesus. Now, when we say that the stories are about faith, we could really go down a wrong path here and say that the healing power of Jesus is conditional on the faith of the person. And if this person is healed and that person isn't, then it must mean that person A had enough faith and person B did not. And that's why you get the results that you do. But I doubt very much that a dead person has any sort of faith, little or great. And yet in Mark 5, a dead girl is healed. And so to make healing conditional on faith is to, I think, have a poor reading of Mark. In Mark's gospel, faith, if you look at the whole picture here, faith has to do with understanding this. Jesus is going to the cross. And I'm making us, if you've been part of this series, I'm making this go fairly slowly through Mark's gospel. But Mark, if you just read it from beginning to end, Mark has Jesus almost in a race to get to the cross. And faith is about following the one who forsakes miracles for himself for death and invites anyone who would want to be faithful to say yes to that. When Mark wrote this, there were no chapters and verses, and we read these two stories here, but if Mark were sitting here talking to us, he might say, hey, keep reading. So if we don't stop at the end of chapter 5 and we just keep reading, you get this. And if you've got your Bible, I'm going to start in Mark chapter 6 here. It says, Jesus left there where these healings had happened, and he went to his hometown, Capernaum, accompanied by his disciples. And when the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed, right? They are amazed. Where did this man get these things, they asked. What's this wisdom that's been given to him that he even does miracles? And then they started thinking, isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, only in his hometown, among his relatives, and in his own house is a prophet without honor. And he could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. And he, Jesus, he was amazed at their what? Lack of faith. It's really interesting that right after he's done these two absolutely amazing miracles in Mark 5, that it's immediately followed by this story of the rejection of Jesus. Even with him, again, healing some people there in his hometown. And it's kind of a foreshadowing that gets us ready for that ultimate rejection of Jesus. So even though Jesus is doing these spectacular miracles, tons of people are not coming to faith in him. And so that leaves a hard question for you and I, looking at these wonderful stories that happen to these people. And the questions are like this. What are we in this for? Are we in it for just the benefits? Maybe the chance for a better job if I fly straight enough and pray enough, or the relationships that I could have with people who might be a little bit more moral than maybe some of my neighbors, or people at my job, and better people to expose my kids to. And those don't seem like bad goals or bad motives, do they? It might not be too wrong to want those, but those can't be the only thing. And so are we in it for the miracles, or are we just flat out full of love for Jesus and willing to follow him to the cross? Because it seems to me that too often we're a fairly comfortable culture, somewhat entitled culture, and it seems that too often we could find ourselves more interested in the miracles than we are in the mission. And if you think about when you read this story, or both of these stories here, how they're tied together, who do you identify with when you read them? I identify with the victims most easily. I want to be healed, don't you? I would love for my left eye to work better. I would love for my back to be healed. I want my shoulders to not hurt so much. I would like my emotional hurts and stressors to just kind of be wiped away. I want to be the recipient of Jesus's compassion and miracles. I absolutely would love healing. But ultimately, Jesus says, okay, I can do these things. But what I really want is for you to follow in my steps and die to yourself. This is not about miracles. It's about the mission. And Mark's overall gospel reminds us that the one who can raise the dead is the one who is choosing to die. And so we kind of have a mixed message today. And it's not an either or scenario. On the one hand, I want to say to those of you who, like me, are sick and are broken and have all sorts of pains and scars, you are following a Savior who can heal. And he is compassionate. You are following a compassionate Lord who understands our sickness, our suffering, the struggles that we have with death, how we have been embarrassed or abandoned. He understands our loneliness and our weakness. He understands all of that, and he can heal. But what Jesus really wants for you and what he wants for me is to call us to his side and say, okay, I got you. But let's take up our crosses for the sake of a hurting and dying world. And both of those are good news. It's absolutely harder to say, God, if it will better serve your kingdom, let me suffer. It actually might even be tough to say, God, if it will serve your kingdom best, then please heal me. Because I really want this to be about the mission and not just the miracles. We would have loved for a miracle of healing to have happened in Lauren's life. Lauren would have loved a miracle. But she wasn't following Jesus for the miracles. In the middle of the rejoicing over this raised girl and this healed woman in Mark's gospel, there is a little bit of sadness because while the people love the miracles, it turns out a lot of them don't really love Jesus. And in this Christmas season, there's going to be lots of warm, mushy feelings that can happen out there. Because of the season, there will be romantic experiences by the thousands. But let's not forget that Christmas is about a baby who came into our world so he could grow up and die a horribly gruesome death on a cross. But he did it because of the joy before him. That joy was knowing that through his own sacrifice, a way could be made for me, and a way could be made for you to have full and unending life with God. Jesus became poor in so many ways so that you and I could become rich. So let's respond to Jesus with a tough determination that says, I will take up my cross and follow Jesus. Not because he does miracles, but because he's Jesus. God bless you guys. Let's worship a little bit more together and enjoy being able to commune together.